The scale was extraordinary. Paint production, design staff, application crews, documentation systems supporting one of the largest applied camouflage programs in military history. Within months of the armistice, the Royal Navy began repainting vessels in standard gray. Dazzle was expensive to maintain, considered unsuitable for peacetime service. The wild patterns disappeared, but the knowledge survived. The deeper principle that made Dazzle work, that corrupting an enemy's targeting, data can be more effective than hiding from detection, would resurface. Throughout modern warfare, electronic warfare systems that jam radar, stealth aircraft that create ambiguous radar returns rather than true invisibility, naval decoy systems that project false infrared signatures, all of these descend conceptually from Wilkinson's insight. The lesson wasn't about paint or pattern specifically. It was about understanding the enemy's kill chain, the sequence of actions required to successfully attack, and identifying which link was most vulnerable to disruption. For U-boats, that vulnerable link was the 40-second window in which the commander had to convert visual observation into accurate firing data. Dazzle attacked that window relentlessly. The irony is that Dazzle Camouflage has become associated with artistic expression and aesthetic innovation featured in museums and design histories, while its brutal tactical effectiveness has been somewhat forgotten. Those zebra stripes weren't art for art's sake. They were precision weapons designed to corrupt enemy targeting, systems through optical disruption, tested through systematic experimentation, proven through statistical analysis of thousands of convoy crossings. Every wild slash of paint, every impossible angle, every false bow wave was there to buy a few degrees of error, a few knots of miscalculation, just enough to send a torpedo past instead of home. In the cold mathematics of naval warfare, where the difference between survival and death measured in meters, Dazzle patterns gave merchant vessels and warships alike a measurable advantage. They turned the oceans, empty expanse from a killing ground where ships were helpless targets, into an arena where visual deception could defeat technical precision. Norman Wilkinson wasn't an artist playing at war. He was a tactician who understood that sometimes the best defense isn't hiding. Sometimes it's making absolutely sure your enemy can't figure out what the hell they're looking at until it's too late to matter. And in the North Atlantic, in the gray morning light of October 1917, Lieutenant Commander Kurt Metzenthin learned that lesson the hard way. Watching two torpedoes streak harmlessly past a ship that shouldn't have existed, painted in patterns that broke every rule he'd been taught. The SS industry steamed on. She'd be one of thousands. October 23, 1917. Dawn light across the North Atlantic. Through the narrow glass of his periscope, Lieutenant Commander Kurt Metzenthin watched a merchant ship materialize from the morning haze. Range, 2,400 meters. Bearing, off the starboard bow. Everything about this moment was routine. He'd done it 14 times before, sent 14 Allied ships to the bottom using the same cold calculus they'd drilled into him at the Imperial Naval Academy. Measure the angle, read the bow wave, calculate deflection, set the gyroscope, fire, except nothing about this ship made sense. The vessel ahead looked like someone had taken a paintbrush and gone completely insane. Black and white stripes slashed across the hull in directions that shouldn't exist. The bow seemed to point toward him. The stern angled away. Or was it the other way around? His eyes tracked the movement. 8 knots, maybe? No, wait. 15? He ran the numbers again. Adjusted. Recalculated. 2 torpedoes screamed away into the gray water. Both missed. The SS Industry steamed on, untouched, her hull a riot of impossible geometry. She was actually making 11 knots on a heading 40 degrees different from what Metzenthin had calculated. He'd never know that. He just knew he'd missed. And somewhere in the back of his mind, A question formed that he wouldn't be able to answer. What the hell am I looking at? That was the whole point. This wasn't camouflage. Not in any way that made sense to anyone who'd studied military concealment. The man who invented it, a Royal Naval volunteer, reserve officer named Norman Wilkinson, understood something the Admiralty didn't want to hear. You can't hide a 450-foot steamer in the middle of the ocean. The Atlantic doesn't give you mountains or forests or shadows to disappear into. It's just you and the horizon and whoever's hunting you. So Wilkinson proposed something that sounded completely mad. Make the ships more visible. Paint them in patterns so confusing, so visually aggressive, that enemy U-boat commanders couldn't figure out which way they were going, how fast they were moving, or what type of vessel they were looking at. Rob them of the 3 pieces of information they absolutely needed to sink you. The Admiralty thought he'd lost his mind. Wilkinson was an artist, a marine painter with exactly 0 formal engineering credentials. This was 1917, and the traditional thinking was brutally simple. Either you painted ships gray to make them invisible, or you accepted that visibility was inevitable and hoped for the best. You didn't make yourself easier to see. But by war's end, over 4,000 Allied vessels wore these wild, impossible patterns. And the statistics told a story the skeptics couldn't ignore. Dazzle-painted ships were 30% less likely to be successfully torpedoed than conventionally painted vessels of the same type. 30%. That's not luck. That's something else entirely. Naval strategists in 1917 operated on what seemed like common sense. Camouflage means concealment. The Royal Navy had been experimenting with various shades of gray, blue-gray, horizon blue, anything to help a ship fade into the sea and sky. It was the same principle that had worked on land. Khaki uniforms, field gray, horizon blue. Make yourself harder to see. Survive longer. The Germans were doing the same thing with their Kriegsmarine vessels, soft grays and blues that performed reasonably well in Baltic and North Sea conditions. On paper, the logic was airtight. Can't shoot what you can't see. But here's what the theorists missed. By 1917, German submarines weren't hunting with their eyes. They weren't scanning the horizon from miles away, hoping to spot a target. They already knew where the ships were. Wireless intercepts of convoy positions, predictable shipping lanes, basic probability. A U-boat commander at 800 meters from a merchant vessel could see the damn thing, regardless of how it was painted. The critical moment wasn't detection. It was the 30 to 45 seconds he had to calculate. A firing solution while his periscope was up, exposed, vulnerable to ramming or depth charges. That narrow window when he had to convert what he was seeing into numbers that would put a torpedo into a ship's engine room. Traditional military thinking focused on making ships harder to find. Wilkinson understood the real problem, making them harder to hit. The technical reality of a submarine torpedo attack required extraordinary precision under absolutely terrible conditions. A G7E torpedo, standard German weapon, traveled at 30 knots with a range of 5,000 meters. To hit a moving target, the U-boat commander needed 3 variables, and he needed them accurate. The target's heading, within 5 to 10 degrees. Its speed, within 2 to 3 knots. Its type, which told him where the machinery spaces were, where the kill shot needed to land. He was making these calculations through a periscope that gave him maybe 6 degrees of field of view, often in poor visibility, with the ship's wake creating optical distortions. And he had about 40 seconds before he had to drop the scope or risk getting spotted and killed. Any error, even small, meant the torpedo would pass ahead, or astern, or harmlessly along the hull. Miss by inches in the calculation. Miss by meters in reality. The genius of Dazzle was that it attacked every single one of those calculations systematically. The patterns used high-contrast geometric shapes, mostly black and white, occasionally blue or green, arranged to create false perspective cues that your brain couldn't help but process. A painted bow wave amidships made the vessel look like it was heading in a completely different direction. Vertical stripes disrupted your eye's ability to track horizontal motion, turning speed estimation into guesswork. Curved patterns wrapped around the hull created shadows that didn't exist, making it impossible to tell where the bow ended and the superstructure began. These weren't random. Each ship got a custom design based on its silhouette, its typical operating speed, the angles it would most likely be viewed from. The designs were tested using scale models viewed through replica periscopes at the Royal Academy in Burlington House, where Wilkinson set up a design studio staffed by 11 officers and over 200 personnel, artists, model makers, mathematicians. The brilliance was in exploiting the periscope's fundamental limitation. Looking through that narrow tube, a submarine commander couldn't see the whole ship at once. He had to pan across it, building a mental picture as he went. Dazzle patterns deliberately created contradictions in that mental picture. The bow suggested one heading, the stern suggested another. Painted structures created the illusion of a false bow entirely. You could make a ship look like it was steaming backwards. What made it work wasn't any one element. It was the systematic assault on every visual cue submarine commanders relied on to stay alive. Critics screamed that high-contrast patterns would make ships more visible, increasing the likelihood of attack. They were right about the first part. Dazzle ships were spotted more easily. They were catastrophically wrong about what mattered. The proof came in the western approaches and the Atlantic convoy routes throughout 1918. HMS Alsatian, an 18,000-ton armed merchant cruiser painted in sweeping black and white curves that made her bow appear to face the opposite direction from her actual heading, survived 3 separate U-boat attacks between March and July. 3 times, someone tried to kill her. 3 times, the torpedoes went wide. Captured German naval records told the story from the other side. Captain Leitmann Otto Steinbrink, commander of U-63, wrote in frustration, "Fired at large steamer bearing 320 degrees. Range estimated 1,800 meters. Speed estimated 10 knots. 2 torpedoes. Both missed ahead. Post-action analysis suggests actual bearing was 280 degrees. Range 2,100 meters. Speed 14 knots. The vessel's painted pattern made accurate assessment impossible." Impossible. That's the word he used. The statistical evidence was even more damning. The Royal Navy analyzed 2,367 dazzle-painted merchant vessels versus 2,318 conventionally painted vessels of similar tonnage operating during the same period. Of dazzle-painted ships attacked by submarines, 11.3% were successfully torpedoed and sunk. Of conventionally painted vessels attacked, 16.2% went down. But here's the detail that really tells the story. Dazzle ships that were hit required an average of 1.8 torpedoes per sinking. Conventional ships only needed 1.3. Even when U-boat commanders managed to hit dazzle vessels, their aim was off enough that torpedoes struck less vulnerable areas, forward or aft of the critical machinery spaces instead of amidships, where a single hit could break a ship's. Back May 12, 1918, the USS Olympic, sister ship to the Titanic, was steaming from Southampton to New York, carrying 6,000 American troops. She'd been repainted the previous year in a dazzle scheme featuring aggressive diagonal stripes and false bow waves painted on both sides of her 882-foot hull. She'd already carried over 200,000 soldiers across the Atlantic. U-103 had her in the crosshairs. The submarine fired from less than 600 meters. At that range, it should have been a near-certain kill. The torpedo missed by an estimated 40 feet. Olympic spotted the periscope, turned hard, and rammed the submarine, a glancing blow that crushed U-103's conning tower and forced her to surface. The crew abandoned ship. A destroyer escort finished her off. Post-war interviews with Olympics officers revealed something chilling. The U-boat had fired from point-blank range, close enough that missing should have been nearly impossible. The dazzle pattern had caused a severe enough miscalculation that a submarine commander at 600 meters couldn't hit an 882-foot target. Think about that for a second. This wasn't magic. It wasn't some mystical effect. The effectiveness came from understanding human visual perception under stress. When a U-boat commander looked at a dazzle ship, his brain tried to resolve contradictory visual information into something coherent. The vertical lines suggested one speed. The angle patterns suggested another direction. The painted shadows suggested false depth. Under peacetime conditions, with unlimited observation time, your brain would eventually sort it out. But with 40 seconds on the clock, with depth charges potentially inbound, with the pressure of knowing a miss meant losing tactical surprise and possibly getting killed, the U-boat commander had to make snap judgments. Dazzle systematically corrupted those judgments. The design philosophy represented a profound shift in defensive thinking. Traditional camouflage assumed the enemy would engage in a straightforward observation-detection attack sequence. It tried to break that sequence at step 1 by preventing detection. Dazzle accepted that detection was inevitable and instead attacked step 2, accurate targeting. Wilkinson understood something that wouldn't be formally articulated until cognitive psychology research in the 1960s. The human brain relies on Gestalt principles, the tendency to perceive whole patterns rather than individual elements. Disrupt those patterns, and you create measurable cognitive delays. The human mind isn't built to handle impossible geometry at high speed under stress. The Germans tried countermeasures, but the nature of submarine warfare limited their effectiveness. Some U-boat training programs incorporated dazzle-painted ship models, teaching commanders to spend more time observing, to take multiple periscope observations from different angles and cross-check their estimates. It worked in training. It failed in combat. The longer a periscope stayed up, the greater the detection risk. By mid-1918, Allied convoy escorts had become deadly efficient at spotting periscopes, and the introduction of hydrophone listening devices meant a submarine lingering near a convoy risked getting depth-charged to pieces. Captured records from U-boat commanders show the same pattern repeating: sight a dazzle-painted vessel, attempt calculations, second-guess those calculations, and either hold fire, losing the opportunity, or fire with low confidence and watch the torpedoes miss. The paint specifications mattered too. The Royal Navy mandated formulations that maintained high contrast in varying light conditions. The black used manganese dioxide and carbon black pigments that stayed dark when wet, avoiding the problem of dark colors looking gray in rain or spray. The white used titanium dioxide and zinc oxide compounds that resisted yellowing from salt exposure. Each vessel required between 800 and 1,500 gallons of paint, applied in specific patterns documented in Wilkinson's design books. Massive classified volumes containing over 2,000 individual ship designs, each with multiple views showing how the pattern should appear from various angles. If a dazzle-painted ship was captured, the Germans would have the design principles. The books stayed secret. Merchant seamen initially hated the patterns. They considered them garish, unmilitary, absurd. Royal Navy destroyer crews nicknamed dazzle-painted vessels the floating circuses and Wilkinson's follies. Then word started spreading that dazzle ships were surviving attacks. By early 1918, merchant crews specifically requested dazzle patterns. Some captains refused to sail with conventional paint, considering it a death sentence. This wasn't superstition. It was practical risk assessment based on survival rates that were becoming widely known in the merchant marine community. The psychological effect worked in reverse on U-boat crews. Captured German sailors reported that dazzle-painted ships were unnatural and difficult to look at through the periscope. Some described physical discomfort, mild nausea, eye strain from prolonged observation. While these subjective reports weren't systematic, they suggested dazzle patterns created genuine physiological responses, not just tactical confusion. Your brain doesn't like being lied to, especially when the lie might get you killed. The mathematics reveal why dazzle worked so devastatingly well. A standard torpedo run at 2,000 meters against a target moving at 12 knots meant the torpedo had to travel for approximately 120 seconds. During that time, the target would move roughly 750 meters. The U-boat commander wasn't aiming at where the ship was, he was aiming at where it would be when the torpedo arrived. This required precise knowledge of both heading and speed. 10-degree error in estimating heading translated to the torpedo passing approximately 350 meters off target at 2,000-meter range. A 3-knot error in speed estimation meant the torpedo would miss by roughly 180 meters ahead or astern. Dazzle patterns routinely induced heading errors of 20 to 40 degrees and speed errors of 5 to 8 knots. These weren't occasional mistakes. They were systematic failures caused by corrupted visual data. Land camouflage had demonstrated that movement, shadow, and broken outlines could deceive. Wilkinson adapted those principles to the unique constraints of naval warfare. But while land camouflage sought to blend with terrain, naval dazzle sought to create ambiguity in a featureless environment. There was nothing to blend with on the open ocean, so the strategy became creating internal contradictions that prevented accurate measurement. This wasn't obvious to critics, because it required understanding both the technical constraints of submarine warfare and the cognitive processes of visual estimation under time pressure. Staff officers evaluating dazzle in calm dockside conditions with unlimited time to observe frequently concluded it didn't work. They were testing the wrong thing. The question wasn't whether an observer with infinite time could determine a ship's heading. It was whether a U-boat commander with 40 seconds and one chance could do so accurately enough to sink it. By November 1918, over 4,000 British vessels had been dazzle-painted, along with significant numbers of Allied merchant ships and warships from the United States, France, and Italy. American dazzle designs, created under artist Everett Warner at the United States Shipping Board, followed similar principles but incorporated American ship silhouettes and operating patterns. The question wasn't whether an observer with infinite time could determine a ship's heading. It was whether a U-boat commander with 40 seconds and one chance could do so accurately enough to sink it. By November 1918, over 4,000 British vessels had been dazzle-painted, along with significant numbers of Allied merchant ships and warships from the United States, France, and Italy. American dazzle designs, created under artist Everett Warner at the United States Shipping Board, followed similar principles but incorporated American ship silhouettes and operating patterns.